The arrest that changed everything. The morning air was crisp, filled with the gentle hum of life waking up in the heart of Atlanta. Melanie Carter stretched as the first golden rays of sunlight streamed through her bedroom window. Today was special. Today was the day she would find the perfect gift for the love of her life. Her husband, Marcus. She turned to see him sleeping peacefully beside her, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Even after 10 years of marriage, she still found herself in awe of the man she had married. Marcus was more than just her husband. He was her best friend, her protector, and the embodiment of justice. A highly respected attorney, Marcus had spent years defending those who couldn't afford proper legal representation. His passion for justice and fairness had always inspired her. A smile tugged at Melanie's lips as she leaned down to place a soft kiss on his cheek. "Happy birthday, my love," she whispered. Marcus stirred slightly but didn't wake. She decided to let him sleep a little longer. Slipping out of bed, she wrapped herself in a cozy robe and made her way to the kitchen. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as she prepared her morning cup, savoring the warmth of the mug against her palms. Today wasn't just about work or meetings, it was about finding the perfect birthday gift for Marcus. He always made her feel cherished, surprising her with thoughtful gifts and heartfelt gestures. This year, she wanted to return the favor in a way that truly captured her love and admiration for him. Melanie was a woman of ambition and drive. She had built her own small business from the ground up, a marketing consultancy that helped small businesses thrive in competitive markets. Despite the stress that came with running her own company, she loved the independence it gave her. But today, work could wait. "I'll take a long lunch break," she decided, sipping her coffee. "That'll give me time to find something special." She glanced at her wrist, touching the delicate silver bracelet Marcus had given her years ago. It was the first gift he had ever bought her, a symbol of his love, wrapped in the simplest yet most meaningful of ways. Now it was her turn to return that sentiment. An hour later, Melanie was dressed in a stylish but comfortable blue dress, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked into Elite Treasures, one of the most exclusive jewelry stores in town. The store exuded luxury, glass cases filled with shimmering diamonds, polished gold, and elegant timepieces. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the sleek marble floors, and the scent of fresh-cut roses filled the air. This was the kind of place where people came to make grand statements of love and commitment. Melanie moved slowly through the aisles, her fingers grazing the edges of velvet displays. She was lost in thought, envisioning Marcus's reaction to each elegant watch she considered. A luxury watch was timeless, just like their love. But as she admired the pieces, something shifted. The atmosphere around her changed subtly, like an unspoken tension creeping into the air. Unbeknownst to her, Mr. Griffin, the store's owner, had been watching her ever since she walked in. His brow furrowed as he observed her, a flicker of suspicion darkening his expression. She matched the description of a shoplifter from last week, at least in his mind. Same skin tone, same height. His stomach tightened. He had worked too hard to build this business to let another thief walk out with his merchandise. Melanie, oblivious to his growing unease, picked up a sleek silver watch. It was perfect. She turned it over in her hands, admiring its craftsmanship. Marcus would love it. "Excuse me," she said, motioning to a nearby sales associate. "Could I see this one up close, please?" The young woman smiled and nodded, unlocking the case with delicate precision. She handed Melanie the watch, along with a magnifying glass to examine the intricate details. Behind the counter, Mr. Griffin's fingers hovered over the silent alarm button. "Keep an eye on her," he whispered to one of the security guards near the entrance. The two guards exchanged glances, their postures shifting subtly into readiness. The first guard, a tall man in a dark suit, moved to the other side of the room, pretending to browse the men's collection of cufflinks. His eyes, hidden behind tinted glasses, never left Melanie. The second guard made his way toward the main exit, positioning himself strategically. Still unaware of the growing tension, Melanie smiled at the sales associate. "I'll take this one, please," she said, handing the watch back. The young woman nodded, reaching for the case to place it inside. But before she could, Mr. Griffin's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Ma'am, I need you to stop right there." Melanie turned, surprised by the sharpness in his tone. "I'm sorry." Mr. Griffin's face was set in a stern expression. The security guards were now closing in, their stances rigid with authority. "Hand over the watch," one of them demanded. A cold sensation crawled up Melanie's spine. I was about to buy it." Mr. Griffin stepped forward, crossing his arms. "We have reason to believe you were attempting to steal that watch, ma'am." The accusation hit Melanie like a gut punch. The room suddenly felt smaller, the lights harsher. Her heart pounded. "What? No, you've got this all wrong. I was just—" "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," one of the guards interrupted, gripping her arm firmly. Melanie flinched, yanking her arm away instinctively. "Let go of me." The guard's grip tightened. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Fear spiked in Melanie's chest. The customers had stopped shopping. The store had gone silent. All eyes were on her, but no one stepped forward to help. Her breath hitched. "Please, check the cameras." "I didn't steal anything." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The police were already on their way. Within minutes, the piercing sound of sirens filled the air. The moment the officers entered, everything became a blur. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Melanie's world tilted. Handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "Wait, please. This is a mistake." But the officers barely acknowledged her protests. She was led out of the store, past stunned onlookers, and into the waiting patrol car. As the doors slammed shut behind her, a single thought echoed in her mind. Marcus. She needed him. She needed him now. The fight begins. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Melanie's wrists, a stark contrast to the warmth of the afternoon sun filtering through the police cruiser's windows. Every breath felt heavy. Every second stretched unbearably long. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. She had just wanted to buy a gift for her husband. Now she was being driven away like a criminal, her wrists bound, her dignity stripped. Through the tinted windows, Melanie could see the growing crowd outside Elite Treasures. Bystanders held up their phones, recording the arrest with wide-eyed curiosity. The weight of their gazes made her stomach churn. Would those videos show the truth? Or would the world only see what they had been conditioned to believe? That a black woman in a luxury store must be guilty of something. The police officer in the driver's seat glanced at her in the rearview mirror. His face was unreadable, but his silence felt damning. "Please," Melanie's voice cracked. "You have the wrong person. This is a mistake." Neither officer responded. She swallowed back the lump in her throat. "Stay calm, Melanie. You need to think." Her mind raced. Marcus will fix this." As the cruiser turned onto a busy street, she willed herself to focus. She needed to remember every detail, every injustice. The moment she was taken, the words they used, the way no one had listened to her. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something far worse. Her heart pounded as they approached the Atlanta Police Department. The sight of the gray concrete building sent a fresh wave of panic crashing over her. This wasn't just a detour. She was about to be booked into a jail cell. The station. The officers pulled Melanie out of the cruiser and guided her toward the entrance. Their grips were firm, but not rough. They had done this before. To them, she was just another suspect. A receptionist, an older black woman with graying curls, glanced up from her desk. Her lips parted slightly as if she recognized the injustice before her, but she said nothing. Melanie's stomach twisted. She was led down a narrow hallway into a holding area lined with metal benches bolted to the floor. The air smelled of stale sweat and disinfectant. "Name?" the booking officer asked, barely looking up from his screen. "Melanie Carter," she whispered. "Date of birth?" She answered each question mechanically. With each response, she felt herself slipping further away from the life she had known, the life where she was a respected entrepreneur, a woman who had built something from nothing. Fingerprinting came next, then the mugshot. Her hands trembled as she held up the sign bearing her name. A camera flashed. She would never forget the sound. Finally, an officer guided her toward a holding cell at the end of the corridor. The heavy metal door groaned as it opened. "Wait," Melanie protested, panic surging through her veins. "Please, I need to call my husband." The officer barely glanced at her. "You'll get your call in a little while." Then, the door slammed shut. The echo rattled in her bones. She was alone. Marcus gets the call. Across town, Marcus Carter sat in his office, buried under a pile of legal documents. His sharp brown eyes scanned the paperwork in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. He had been feeling uneasy all morning. Something was wrong. His assistant knocked on his office door, peeking inside. "Mr. Carter, you have a call. It's urgent." Marcus frowned, reaching for the phone. Marcus Carter speaking. The frantic voice on the other end made his blood run cold. "Marcus, it's Lisa. You need to get to the police station now." "It's Melanie. They arrested her." Marcus's heart stopped. "What?" His chair scraped against the floor as he shot to his feet. "Lisa, slow down. What happened?" Lisa's voice wavered. "I was at Elite Treasures when it happened. Marcus, they accused her of stealing. It's all over social media. There are videos of them arresting her." Marcus's free hand clenched into a fist. "Stealing? Melanie, this had to be some kind of sick joke." "Lisa," Marcus said through gritted teeth, "I'm on my way." He slammed the phone down and grabbed his coat. His assistant opened her mouth to ask what was wrong, but Marcus was already out the door. The drive to the station was a blur. His thoughts raced, each one more infuriating than the last. Melanie in a jail cell. Over what? Some store owner's bias. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a violation of everything he stood for. Marcus Carter had spent his entire career fighting for the innocent. And now, the person who mattered most to him had been treated like a criminal. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The confrontation. When Marcus stormed into the station, the energy in the room shifted. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew who he was. "Where is she?" Marcus demanded, his deep voice cutting through the noise. The desk sergeant, a balding man with tired eyes, looked up. "Sir, you'll need to wait." Marcus leaned in, his fists pressing against the desk. "You don't understand. My innocent wife is in one of your cells. I want to see her. Now." The sergeant hesitated. "Sir, we're still processing her." Marcus slammed his palm onto the counter. "I want to see her. And then, I want to speak to whoever is responsible for this mess." At that moment, Police Chief Howard stepped out from his office, adjusting his belt. He had been expecting Marcus. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice heavy, "let's talk in my office." Marcus followed him, his body thrumming with restrained fury. Inside, he wasted no time. "You arrested my wife without cause," Marcus stated, his tone controlled but lethal. "She was shopping for my birthday gift, and now she's in a cell. Explain yourself." Chief Howard sighed, rubbing his temple. The store owner made a report. She matched the description of a previous suspect. "Did anyone check the cameras?" Marcus snapped. The chief hesitated. The owner insisted. Marcus let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "So let me get this straight. A black woman walks into a luxury store, and that alone is enough to arrest her." Chief Howard opened his mouth, but Marcus wasn't finished. "You know this is a lawsuit waiting to happen, right? You arrested my wife, a law-abiding citizen, a respected businesswoman, without probable cause. This isn't just negligence. This is racial profiling." Silence hung thick in the air. The chief finally exhaled. I'll look into it. You'll do more than look into it, Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. You're going to release her. Now. The chief held Marcus's gaze for a long moment. Then he reached for his radio. Get Melanie Carter out of holding. Marcus exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening just slightly. But this wasn't over. Not even close. A battle for justice. The heavy clang of the cell door echoed through the quiet hallway as Melanie Carter was led out by a young officer with a nervous expression. Her hands were still cuffed, her wrists sore from the tight metal restraints. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glow, making the entire moment feel surreal. Her heart pounded as she was led toward the front of the station. She had spent hours locked up like a common criminal, her mind cycling through a whirlwind of emotions, fear, rage, humiliation. But the moment she saw Marcus standing there, waiting for her, everything else faded. His eyes locked onto hers, dark with fury and something deeper, something that made her throat tighten. He had come for her. He had always come for her. Take those cuffs off of her. Marcus's voice was ice, sharp enough to slice through steel. The officer hesitated, but a pointed glare from Chief Howard had him scrambling for the key. The moment the cuffs clicked open and fell away, Melanie exhaled shakily, her hands immediately rubbing over the sore skin on her wrists. Marcus stepped forward, his presence a storm brewing on the horizon. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms. She sank into his chest, feeling the strength of him, the steadiness, the unwavering certainty that he would never let this stand. I've got you, he murmured against her hair. You're safe now. Melanie squeezed her eyes shut. Safe. Maybe. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The aftermath at home. By the time they got home, exhaustion weighed heavy on Melanie's body. She collapsed onto the couch, her hands still trembling. Marcus stood in front of her, hands on his hips, pacing back and forth like a lion caged too long. His jaw was tight, his eyes still burning with the kind of anger that didn't go away overnight. We're suing, he said suddenly, stopping in place. His voice was absolute. Melanie looked up at him, her body aching, her mind raw from everything she had been through. Marcus. No, he interrupted, shaking his head. This cannot happen. Not to you. Not to anyone else. She swallowed. The fire in his eyes was something she had seen before, when he was in the middle of a case, fighting for a client who had been wrongfully accused, unfairly treated, or outright framed. The difference now. This time, it was personal. Melanie exhaled slowly. I don't want to let this go. But she broke off, rubbing her arms, trying to erase the feeling of cold metal restraints. Marcus sat down beside her, taking her hands in his. Then we fight. His voice was softer now, but no less determined. Melanie closed her eyes. She had been fighting her whole life. Fighting to build her business from the ground up when people doubted her. Fighting to prove she belonged in rooms where she was overlooked. Fighting the silent battles of every black woman who had ever been made to feel like she didn't belong in a space simply because of the color of her skin. Maybe she was tired of fighting. But if there was one thing she wasn't, it was someone who backed down. She opened her eyes and met Marcus's gaze. Then let's fight. The legal storm begins. The next morning, Marcus was already on the phone before the sun had fully risen. Jim, I need you to draft a civil rights lawsuit against the Atlanta Police Department, Marcus said, his voice crisp as he scrolled through the news articles already covering Melanie's wrongful arrest. And get someone on Elite Treasures too. This was racial profiling, plain and simple. On the other end of the line, Jim Donovan, one of the best civil rights attorneys in the country, exhaled. Marcus, you know this isn't just a simple lawsuit, right? You're talking about going to war with the entire police department and a major business owner. This is going to get national attention. Marcus didn't hesitate. Good. Jim chuckled. I had a feeling you'd say that. Marcus hung up and turned to Melanie, who was sitting at their dining table, scrolling through her phone. Her face was set in stone-cold determination, her finger hovering over a message from a news station requesting an interview. "They want me to speak about what happened," she said, her voice calm but edged with something dangerous. "I think I should." Marcus sat across from her. "Are you ready for that?" She lifted her gaze. "I don't think I'll ever be ready. But that doesn't matter. This story needs to be told." Marcus nodded. She was right. The press conference that changed everything. 2 days later, a crowd gathered in front of City Hall. Reporters, activists, members of the community, and standing at the podium, Melanie Carter. Her voice rang strong and unwavering through the microphones as cameras flashed. "I was arrested, humiliated, handcuffed in front of strangers, all because one man decided I didn't belong in his store." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I am not the first black woman to experience this. I am not the first person to be wrongfully accused, assumed guilty without evidence, treated like a criminal before being given a chance to speak." A pause. "But I will be one of the last. Because we are going to fight." Applause erupted. Marcus stood off to the side, his arms crossed, watching his wife turn her pain into power. This was only the beginning. Elite Treasures faces the fallout. By the next morning, Elite Treasures was making headlines, but not in the way they had hoped. Luxury store faces racial profiling lawsuit after wrongful arrest of prominent businesswoman. Civil rights groups call for boycott of Elite Treasures. Atlanta community demands apology after viral arrest video. Mr. Griffin, the store owner, sat at his desk, staring at the news articles with wide, panicked eyes. His phone had been ringing nonstop, angry customers, furious activists, even his own staff demanding answers. For the first time, he felt something new. Fear. Fear not of shoplifters. Fear of the consequences of his own prejudice. His attorneys advised him to settle. His PR team urged him to apologize. But none of it felt like enough, because he had been wrong. And now, the world knew it. The officers face accountability. Meanwhile, at the police station, Chief Howard was facing his own nightmare. The internal investigation had begun. Officers were placed on administrative leave. Community leaders were demanding policy changes. And at the center of it all, Marcus and Melanie Carter. The reckoning. The city was buzzing. News stations were camped outside the police department. Social media was ablaze with footage of Melanie Carter's arrest. The hashtag Justice for Melanie had gone viral, sparking conversations far beyond Atlanta. But this wasn't just about one woman's wrongful arrest anymore. This was about a system that had failed too many times, a system that was about to be shaken to its core. Mr. Griffin faces the consequences. Inside Elite Treasures, Mr. Griffin sat at his desk, drenched in sweat. His lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman with steel-gray hair, wasn't happy. "We need to talk about damage control," she said, her tone clipped. She slammed a folder down on his desk. "Have you seen this?" Griffin flinched. He had seen it. Every news outlet was covering the fallout. Boycotts were growing. Customers were returning merchandise, refusing to buy from a store that had racially profiled an innocent woman. Civil rights groups were filing complaints. They were demanding an independent investigation into Elite Treasures' history with black customers. His own employees were protesting. Some had quit outright. Others were refusing to work until changes were made. His lawyer exhaled sharply. "You're about to lose everything." Mr. Griffin buried his face in his hands. "How bad is it?" he mumbled. The lawyer gave him a cold stare. "If you don't act fast, you're finished." For the first time since Melanie Carter had walked into his store, fear settled deep in Mr. Griffin's chest. Not fear of thieves. Not fear of loss. Fear of the consequences of his own actions. The police under fire. Meanwhile, at the Atlanta Police Department, Chief Howard stood before a room full of officers, his expression grim. "The mayor's office is demanding an explanation," he said, rubbing his temples. Internal Affairs is reviewing the case, and the department is under public scrutiny like never before. Silence. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Finally, Officer Rodriguez, one of the officers involved in Melanie's arrest, shifted in her seat. "Sir, what happens now?" Chief Howard sighed heavily. "What happens now? We start owning our mistakes." He turned to the two officers who had arrested Melanie. "You're both on unpaid leave until further notice. Internal Affairs will decide if you keep your jobs at all." The room was deathly silent. Rodriguez swallowed hard. "But sir, You didn't follow protocol," Howard snapped. "You didn't check security footage. You didn't ask questions. You didn't even read her rights." His face hardened. "This department isn't going down because of your incompetence." The officers lowered their heads. Chief Howard turned toward the rest of the department. "If you think this is the last time we'll be under scrutiny, you're wrong. The people are watching. Every mistake will be public. Every failure will cost us." He locked eyes with each and every officer in the room. "If you don't like that, hand in your badge now." No one moved, but they all knew things would never be the same again. Melanie's voice shakes the nation. The next morning, Melanie Carter sat across from a news anchor on live television. The set was bright, polished, pristine, a stark contrast to the chaos her life had become. She took a deep breath as the anchor turned to her. "Mrs. Carter," the woman said, her voice even, "tell us, in your own words, what happened that day." Melanie folded her hands in her lap. She was ready. "I walked into a store to buy my husband a birthday gift," she said, "and I walked out in handcuffs." The anchor nodded. "And you did not steal anything?" Melanie's jaw tightened. "No," she said firmly. "I was never even accused of stealing. The store owner, Mr. Griffin, simply assumed I was a thief, and the police, they didn't even question it." The audience was silent. The anchor leaned forward. "Do you believe this was racial profiling?" Melanie met her gaze head-on. "Absolutely." The room shifted. The weight of those words hit like a tidal wave. The anchor glanced at the camera. "And what do you say to those who believe this was just a misunderstanding?" Melanie's eyes burned with years of frustration, of injustice, of unseen battles. "I say that black women have been dealing with misunderstandings like this for generations." She turned to the camera, speaking now to the world. "We have been followed in stores, accused without proof, arrested without cause, stripped of our dignity because of someone else's bias." Her voice didn't shake. "I was lucky. I had a husband who knew the law, who fought for me." She paused. "But what about the women who don't?" The anchor swallowed hard. The question hung in the air. The apology that wasn't enough. Hours later, Mr. Griffin stood before a small crowd outside Elite Treasures. He stepped up to the microphone, his face pale and drawn. "Good evening," he said, his voice hoarse. "I want to start by saying, I deeply regret what happened to Mrs. Carter." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mr. Griffin cleared his throat. "I let my fear and assumptions guide my actions, and in doing so, I wrongfully accused an innocent woman. For that, I apologize." Silence. No applause. No forgiveness. Just expectation. Because an apology wasn't enough. A journalist raised his hand. "Mr. Griffin, are you planning on stepping down?" Griffin hesitated. I will be taking diversity training and implementing changes to store policies." The murmurs grew louder. Another journalist spoke. "Mrs. Carter has filed a lawsuit. Are you settling?" Griffin's jaw tightened. "We are in discussions with her legal team," he said stiffly. It wasn't enough. And he knew it. The lawsuit that changed everything. A week later, the lawsuit was filed. Marcus Carter stood on the steps of the courthouse, a line of microphones in front of him, his wife standing proudly at his side. "This is not just about Melanie," he said. "This is about every black woman who has been made to feel like she doesn't belong in places of privilege." Cameras flashed. This is about accountability, about justice, about ensuring that what happened to my wife never happens again. Melanie took the mic next. We are not asking for just an apology, she said. We are demanding real change. Silence. And then applause. This wasn't just about a wrongful arrest anymore. This was a movement. The tipping point. The lawsuit had been filed. The press had picked up the story. The entire nation was watching. But this wasn't just about one lawsuit, one woman, or one injustice anymore. This was a reckoning. The pressure mounts on Elite Treasures. Inside Elite Treasures, the air was thick with tension. Mr. Griffin sat behind his massive oak desk, staring at a spreadsheet full of red numbers. The fallout had crippled his business in just a matter of days. Sales had plummeted by nearly 60%. Longtime customers had pulled their accounts. Luxury brands were reconsidering their partnerships with him. And the worst part, it wasn't just about money. His name was now synonymous with racial profiling. A knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. His head of PR, a woman named Claire, stepped inside, her expression grim. "We have a problem," she said, tossing a folder onto his desk. Mr. Griffin hesitated before flipping it open. Inside were resignation letters. Not one, not two. 10 employees had quit overnight. His throat went dry. What the hell is happening? Claire folded her arms. People don't want to be associated with a brand that's being boycotted on a national scale. Griffin ran a shaky hand over his face. He had built this business from the ground up. But now, it was crumbling. And it was his fault. Claire exhaled. "We need to do something drastic. We need—" "No," Griffin interrupted, his voice hoarse. "I need to talk to Melanie Carter. Personally." Claire arched an eyebrow. "You really think she wants to hear from you?" Griffin didn't know. But at this point, he had nothing left to lose. The police department under scrutiny. Meanwhile, at the Atlanta Police Department, Chief Howard sat in a closed-door meeting with his top advisors. The tension in the room was suffocating. "Public trust is at an all-time low," one of the senior officers admitted. "People are protesting outside the station every night." Howard already knew. Every morning, his inbox was flooded with angry emails. The mayor's office was breathing down his neck. Internal Affairs was investigating his department's handling of Melanie Carter's arrest. And worst of all, the department was now the target of a civil rights lawsuit. Chief Howard exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "We need to make a decision before this gets even worse." Silence. Then one of the senior officers hesitated before speaking. "We could issue an official statement. A public apology." Howard's eyes darkened. "A public apology won't fix this." Another officer, shifting uncomfortably, cleared his throat. "Then what do we do, sir?" Howard already knew the answer. But it wasn't going to be easy. "We're going to have to make an example out of the officers involved," he said finally. "Suspensions, retraining, disciplinary action." More silence. Then someone muttered under their breath, "This is going to piss off the union." Howard's jaw tightened. Maybe. But at this point, he didn't have a choice. Mr. Griffin's last attempt at redemption. Melanie was sitting in her office when her assistant knocked on the door, looking nervous. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Griffin is here to see you." Melanie's head snapped up. "Mr. Griffin, here." She sat back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Send him in." A moment later, the man himself stepped inside. He looked rougher than before. His eyes were tired, his hair slightly disheveled. For a second, Melanie just stared at him. Then she leaned forward. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here." Griffin's hands trembled slightly as he pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "I know," he admitted, his voice quiet. I deserve that." Melanie didn't say anything. She just waited. "I came because—" He swallowed hard. "Because I need to own what I did." Melanie arched an eyebrow. "Do you, though? Or are you just trying to save your store? Griffin flinched. She wasn't wrong. But it wasn't just about his business anymore. I made a terrible mistake, he said, his voice wavering. I let my bias cloud my judgment. And because of that, I humiliated you. I had you arrested. He exhaled. I ruined your life in ways I'll never fully understand. Melanie's fingers curled into fists. For days, she had imagined what she would say to this man if she ever got the chance. Now, as he sat before her, looking broken, looking like a man who finally realized the weight of what he had done, she didn't know what to say. Griffin swallowed hard. I don't expect your forgiveness, he said. But I do want to make this right. I'm willing to settle the lawsuit. I'll make a public apology. I'll implement mandatory bias training for every employee. Melanie held up a hand, silencing him. You'll do all of that, she said coldly, but not because you want to fix your reputation. She leaned in, her voice sharp as glass. You'll do it because it's the right thing to do. Griffin's throat bobbed. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yes, he whispered. You're right. Melanie exhaled sharply, feeling some of the weight lift off her chest. This wasn't about Griffin's apology. It was about ensuring that what happened to her didn't happen to another black woman. Ever again. The department's reckoning. A few days later, Chief Howard stood in front of a podium, cameras flashing around him. He took a deep breath. And then he spoke. After a full review, we have determined that the officers involved in Mrs. Carter's wrongful arrest violated department protocol. Effective immediately, they will be placed on suspension without pay and required to undergo extensive retraining. The crowd murmured. Howard continued. This incident has forced us to take a hard look at our department. Moving forward, we will be implementing new de-escalation policies, racial bias training, and stricter arrest protocols. Melanie and Marcus stood in the crowd, watching. It wasn't justice, but it was a start. Marcus squeezed Melanie's hand. We did it, he murmured. Melanie exhaled. We're just getting started. The breaking point. The ripple effect of Melanie Carter's wrongful arrest had turned into a full-blown tidal wave. The city was divided. Protesters had taken to the streets. Some carried signs that read "Justice for Melanie," while others demanded police accountability. But not everyone was on their side. Some claimed the store had the right to protect itself. Others accused Melanie of playing the victim. Talk shows debated her case. Radio stations dissected every detail. Comment sections were flooded with arguments. And through it all, Melanie watched. She had never asked to be the face of a movement. But now, she had no choice. The day of the settlement meeting. Melanie sat in the boardroom of her lawyer's office, her hands clasped together. Marcus sat beside her, his jaw set. Across the table sat Mr. Griffin, looking noticeably aged, and his team of lawyers. The air was thick with tension. Jim Donovan, Melanie's lawyer, leaned forward, breaking the silence. We are prepared to move forward with the settlement under the following conditions. He slid a folder across the table. Griffin's lawyer picked it up, scanning the contents. His face remained unreadable, but Griffin's fingers twitched. These terms include a public apology from Mr. Griffin, a monetary settlement, and a commitment to diversity training for all employees, Jim continued. Melanie watched Griffin closely. Would he fight it? Would he resist? Finally, after a long, exhausted sigh, Griffin nodded. I'll agree to the terms, he said, his voice hoarse. Melanie should have felt victory. But all she felt was drained. Griffin turned to her. I was wrong, he said quietly. I hope one day you'll be able to forgive me. Melanie stared at him. She thought of the cold handcuffs on her wrists, the humiliation of being led out in front of strangers, the fear in her chest when the police wouldn't listen. Forgiveness. Maybe one day. But not today. The police department faces the heat. The Atlanta Police Department had no choice but to respond to the growing backlash. Chief Howard stood before a press conference, cameras flashing. After a thorough review, the officers involved in the wrongful arrest of Melanie Carter have been placed on indefinite suspension, he announced. Journalists fired questions at him. "What changes are you making to prevent this from happening again?" one reporter asked. Howard gripped the podium. "We are implementing new policies, including mandatory bias training and stricter arrest protocols. Every officer will be retrained to ensure that situations like this do not happen again." Melanie watched from home, arms crossed. It wasn't enough, because policies meant nothing without accountability. The interview that changed everything. Days later, Melanie sat across from a nationally recognized news anchor, her hands folded in her lap. The cameras were rolling. "Mrs. Carter," the anchor began, "your story has ignited a national conversation about racial profiling and police misconduct. How has this experience changed you?" Melanie inhaled slowly. "I've always known the reality of being a black woman in America," she said, her voice steady. "But to experience it so blatantly, in a place where I should have felt safe, that changed everything." The anchor nodded. "Some people argue that the police were simply doing their job, that this was all a misunderstanding. What do you say to them?" Melanie's jaw tightened. "I say that if I had been a white woman, I wouldn't have been arrested," she said bluntly. The room fell silent. "Bias is not always violent," she continued. "Sometimes it's quiet assumptions. It's being watched in stores. It's being pulled over for no reason. It's being accused without evidence." She turned to the camera. "And we are tired of it." The protest that made history. The following weekend, thousands of people flooded the streets of Atlanta. They marched, holding signs that read, "We belong in every space. Justice for Melanie equals justice for all. End racial profiling." Melanie and Marcus stood at the front of the crowd, leading the way. Marcus turned to her. "You okay?" Melanie exhaled. "I don't know," she admitted. "But this is bigger than me." She stepped onto the makeshift stage, looking out over the sea of people. "This isn't just about me," she called out. "This is about all of us." Cheers erupted. "This is about the next black woman who walks into a store and gets treated like she doesn't belong." More cheers. "This is about the next black man who gets pulled over for no reason." Applause. "This is about ending the cycle." Marcus watched her, pride swelling in his chest. She had never wanted to be a leader, but she had become one anyway. The final blow. A like Treasures shut down 2 months later. With the lawsuits, the boycott, and the mass resignation of employees, Mr. Griffin had no choice but to close the store's doors. Melanie walked past the now vacant storefront one evening, staring at the empty windows where expensive watches once sat. She felt nothing. No joy. No satisfaction. Because this wasn't about destroying one business. It was about forcing change. And there was still so much work to do. The Carter Foundation for Social Justice. 6 months later, Melanie and Marcus launched the Carter Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to fighting racial discrimination in businesses and law enforcement. Their first project, offering free legal representation to victims of wrongful arrests. Marcus stood beside her at the press conference, smiling. "This is just the beginning," he said. Melanie nodded. They had turned pain into purpose, and they weren't stopping anytime soon. The legacy of change. A year had passed since Melanie Carter's wrongful arrest, and in that year, everything had changed. The city of Atlanta was different now. The police department had implemented new reforms. Businesses were rethinking their policies. Communities were having real conversations about bias and discrimination, and at the center of it all, Melanie and Marcus Carter. They hadn't just won a lawsuit. They had started a movement. The Carter Foundation flourishes. The Carter Foundation for Social Justice had become a national force. What started as a simple legal aid initiative had grown into something much bigger. Now, the foundation was providing free legal representation to victims of wrongful arrests. training businesses on how to combat racial profiling, holding police departments accountable for discriminatory practices, educating communities on their rights. Their headquarters, a sleek, modern building in the heart of downtown Atlanta, buzzed with activity every day. Lawyers, activists, community leaders, all working toward one goal: justice, a case that hits home. One afternoon, Melanie sat in her office reviewing case files. A knock sounded at her door. It was Sarah Green, the Foundation's lead attorney. "We have a case," Sarah said, stepping inside, "and I think you're going to want to see this one personally." She placed a file on Melanie's desk. Melanie flipped it open. Her stomach dropped. 16-year-old Elijah Turner, arrested for loitering outside a high-end clothing store. No prior record. No evidence of wrongdoing. Just a young black teenager waiting for his friends. Melanie's hands clenched into fists. It was happening again. She looked up at Sarah. "Get his family on the phone," she said. "I want to meet them today." Meeting Elijah's family. That evening, Melanie and Marcus drove to the Turner household. The small home was warm and inviting, despite the heavy atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Elijah's mother, Denise, greeted them at the door, her eyes red from crying. "Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice shaking, "thank you for coming." Melanie squeezed her hands. "We're here to help." Inside, Elijah sat on the couch, staring at the floor. He looked young, scared, and confused. Marcus sat beside him. "Elijah," he said gently, "can you tell us what happened?" Elijah swallowed hard. His hands fidgeted in his lap. "I was just standing outside the store," he murmured, "waiting for my friends." He paused, his eyes dark with something Melanie recognized all too well. "The security guard kept watching me," he continued. "Then, all of a sudden, 2 cops showed up, said I was acting suspicious. Before I knew it, they had me in cuffs." Denise's voice cracked with anger. "He's just a kid. They treated him like a criminal for standing outside a store." Marcus's jaw tensed. "Did they read you your rights?" Elijah shook his head. "No." Melanie's chest burned. This was exactly what had happened to her. And now it was happening to kids. She turned to Denise. "We're going to fight this," she said, determination in her voice. Denise burst into tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Melanie squeezed her shoulder. "You're not alone." The case that shook the system. The Turner case became national news overnight. Protests erupted across the city. The store that had called the police on Elijah faced a boycott. The officers involved were put under internal investigation, and at the center of it all, Melanie Carter. The courtroom was packed the day Elijah's case went to trial. The prosecution tried to justify his arrest, but Melanie and Marcus Carter's legal team tore their arguments to shreds. There was no probable cause, no evidence of wrongdoing, no reason for an arrest. It was racial profiling, plain and simple. And the judge agreed. "Elijah Turner's record is hereby expunged," the judge announced, "and this court formally condemns the conduct of the officers involved." The courtroom erupted in applause. Denise sobbed into Melanie's shoulder. Elijah's eyes filled with tears. And Melanie? She knew this was just the beginning. A call from Washington. A week later, Melanie's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID. Her heart stopped. The White House. She answered, her voice calm. "This is Melanie Carter." A smooth voice greeted her. "Mrs. Carter, this is the President's office. The President would like to meet with you to discuss national policy reforms on racial discrimination in policing." Melanie stared at the wall. This was bigger than Atlanta now. Bigger than her. But she was ready. "When?" she asked. A meeting that changed the nation. A month later, Melanie Carter stood inside the Oval Office. Across from her sat the President of the United States. Beside her, Marcus. They weren't just here to talk. They were here to demand action. They presented a proposal for a national racial bias accountability program, mandatory bias training for all law enforcement, strict penalties for wrongful arrests, a federal task force to investigate racial discrimination cases. The president listened intently. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "This," he said, "is long overdue. The legacy of change." 2 years later, the Carter Foundation had expanded nationwide. Thousands of businesses had adopted new anti-discrimination policies. Police departments across the country were under new federal oversight. More than 200 cases of racial profiling had been overturned. And Elijah Turner, he had just started college. At his scholarship ceremony, he hugged Melanie tightly. "I wouldn't be here without you," he whispered. Tears stung Melanie's eyes. "No," she said softly. "You wouldn't be here without justice." A final reflection. One evening, Marcus and Melanie sat on their back porch, watching the sunset. "So," Marcus murmured, "did you ever think that walking into a jewelry store would lead to all this?" Melanie chuckled softly. "No," she admitted, "but I'm glad it did." Marcus squeezed her hand. "You changed the world, Mel." She smiled. "No," she corrected. "We changed it together."